What if I told you that in 1969, one racing team figured out how to refuel a race car in 8 seconds flat when everyone else was struggling to do it in 20? Not with some complex million-dollar technology. Not with a team of NASA engineers, but with a fuel rig so brilliantly simple that when competitors saw it, they couldn't believe it was legal. Picture this. It's Riverside International Raceway, 1969. The Trans Am Championship is reaching fever pitch. Ford and Chevrolet are throwing everything they have at each other. Factory teams are burning through budgets that would make your eyes water. And in the middle of this automotive warfare, one man is about to change racing forever with nothing more than physics, pressure, and a tower that looked like it belonged at a rocket launch pad. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten engineering loopholes of classic motorsport. If you're someone who loves deep dives into the mechanical genius and the gray areas of racing history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to understand why Roger Penske's fuel tower was revolutionary, we need to travel back to the late 1960s. The Trans Am series was the hottest thing in American racing. This wasn't NASCAR with its good old boys and modified stock cars running in circles. This was sophisticated road racing with production-based pony cars tackling the most challenging circuits in North America. We are talking about Lime Rock, Watkins Glen, Laguna Seca. These tracks demanded absolutely everything from both the car and the driver. The series had attracted the biggest names in motorsport: Mark Donohue, Parnelli Jones, George Fulmer, Dan Gurney. These weren't just racers. They were artists behind the wheel, and backing them were the full might of Detroit's Big Three. Ford had the Mustang, Chevrolet had the Camaro, Plymouth had the Barracuda. Each manufacturer was pouring millions into development, turning what started as a gentleman's racing series into an all-out technological arms race. The rules were supposedly simple. Take a production car, modify it within strict regulations, and go racing. Engine displacement was capped at 305 cubic inches. Minimum weight was set at 2,800 pounds. You had to use the stock body shell and maintain the original wheelbase. But within those constraints, teams were finding every possible advantage. And in racing, every advantage matters. Here's the thing about endurance racing that casual fans don't always appreciate. It's not just about having the fastest car. It's about consistency, reliability, and critically, efficiency in the pits. A typical Trans Am race ran anywhere from 2.5 to 6 hours. That meant multiple fuel stops, and in a series where the racing was so close that positions were decided by seconds, those pit stops could make or break your race. According to historical race data from the Sports Car Club of America, the average margin of victory in 1968 was less than 14 seconds. Every fraction of a moment spent stationary was blood in the water. Now, you might be thinking, isn't pouring gas just pouring gas? How much time can you really save? Actually, quite a lot. The standard refueling process in 1969 was primitive by today's standards. Teams used gravity-fed dumped cans that held about 11 gallons each. The procedure was straightforward but painfully slow. Jack the car up, change tires if needed, pour in the fuel, wait for it to drain, repeat with a second can if necessary. The fuel flowed at whatever rate gravity and atmospheric pressure allowed. On a good day with a well-drilled crew, you might complete a fuel stop in 15 seconds. More typically, it took 18 to 20 seconds, sometimes longer if the fuel wouldn't flow smoothly or if the vent system wasn't working perfectly. Those seconds added up over the course of a 3-hour race with 4 pit stops. A team losing 5 seconds per stop to their rivals meant starting the final stint 20 seconds behind. In Trans Am, 20 seconds might as well have been 20 minutes. The racing was simply that close. Enter Roger Penske. In 1969, Penske was still building his racing empire. He wasn't yet the titan of motorsport he would become, but he had something that set him apart from the established teams. He had an engineer's mindset and an absolute refusal to accept that things had to be done the way they'd always been done. Penske looked at the refueling problem and saw physics, specifically fluid dynamics. Here's what most people don't realize about fluid transfer. The rate at which liquid flows from one container to another depends on several factors: the size of the opening, the height difference between the containers, and most importantly, the pressure differential. Traditional dump cans relied solely on gravity and atmospheric pressure. What if you could add pressure to the equation? The concept was simple. If you could pressurize the fuel container, you could force the fuel into the car's tank much faster than gravity alone would allow. This is where it gets really interesting. Executing this concept within the rules was anything but simple. Penske's solution was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. He built a fuel tower that stood nearly 20 feet tall. That is about 6 meters for those keeping track. This wasn't just height for height's sake. Think of a water tower in a small town. The water is stored high up to create hydrostatic pressure in the pipes below. Every foot of elevation added roughly 0.433 psi of pressure due to gravity. 20 feet of height meant an additional 8.66 psi pushing that fuel down. But Penske wasn't satisfied with just gravity alone. The tower incorporated a pressurization system that added controlled air pressure. This was an absolute game changer overnight. But forcing fuel into a tank at high pressure creates a massive new problem: heat. And Penske's solution to that heat was nothing short of brilliant. Now, the exact pressure values that Penske was running were a closely guarded secret at the time, but estimates from competitors suggest that he was running somewhere between 15 and 20 psi of total pressure. That's roughly equivalent to the pressure you would find in a typical car tire. It really doesn't sound like a massive amount of pressure, does it? But when you are trying to violently shove 11 gallons of highly combustible racing fuel through a restricted opening, that extra 15 psi makes all the difference in the world. It was a complete game changer. But here's what most people don't realize. When you pressurize a liquid, basic thermodynamics dictate that you are going to create heat. Compress a gas or a fluid, and the temperature naturally rises. That generated heat directly transfers to the fuel itself. Now you might be thinking, why does warm fuel matter? Well, hot fuel is physically less dense than cold fuel. This essentially means you are literally getting less actual energy per gallon when the liquid is warm. In a sport where every single fraction of a horsepower matters, putting hot fuel into your race car's tank is basically like voluntarily giving up raw power. It is a strategic mistake that could easily cost you a hard-fought victory. So, what did Penske do? He didn't just accept the heat penalty. This is where it gets really interesting. Penske's tower ingeniously incorporated a dedicated cooling system. The pressurized fuel was carefully routed to pass through a custom heat exchanger that kept it at an absolutely optimal temperature. Some reports from the era suggest that he was actually cooling the fuel well below ambient temperature, actively increasing its physical density and, therefore, its overall energy content. Think of it exactly like packing a suitcase for a vacation. If you just blindly throw your clothes in, you can only fit so much stuff. But if you carefully fold and vacuum seal them, you can magically pack way more into the exact same physical space. Cold fuel is precisely like those vacuum-sealed clothes. You are physically packing more explosive energy into the exact same finite volume of the fuel tank. Imagine that for a second. Not only was Roger Penske putting fuel into his Camaros drastically faster than anyone else in the Trans Am paddock, but he was also putting in better, more energy-dense fuel. It was an absolute engineering masterclass that left the rest of the grid completely stunned. Let's look at the actual engineering details of this towering contraption because they are absolutely fascinating. The main structure was meticulously constructed from high-grade aluminum tubing to provide a perfect balance of lightweight portability and brute structural strength. At the very top, the massive fuel reservoir could effortlessly hold 22 gallons of fuel. That was enough capacity for 2 complete pit stops plus a safety reserve. The pressurization system itself cleverly utilized regulated compressed air drawn straight from standard scuba diving tanks. The cooling system reportedly used a relatively simple but highly effective ice bath heat exchanger, though some sources claim Penske boldly experimented with more exotic cooling methods. The fuel delivery hose was another piece of pure engineering art. Standard dump cans used a basic spout that you shoved blindly into the car's filler neck. Penske developed a custom quick connect fitting that seamlessly sealed perfectly with the car's system. There was absolutely no spillage, no dangerous vapor loss, and zero wasted time trying to desperately align the can with the filler neck. The mechanic simply walked up, connected the hose with a satisfying click, and forcefully squeezed the trigger. The results were immediate and completely devastating. While rival teams were taking 15 to 20 agonizing seconds to carefully refuel, Penske's Camaros were consistently completing fuel stops in 8 seconds, sometimes even less. 7.8 seconds was the incredibly fast recorded time, though that may have genuinely been with a partial fill. Still, cutting your crucial refueling time squarely in half is an absolutely enormous strategic advantage in racing. Let's put that stark reality perfectly into perspective. In a grueling 3-hour race featuring 4 separate pit stops, Penske was systematically gaining 40 to 50 precious seconds on his rivals solely from refueling. That's nearly an entire minute of undisputed advantage earned completely off the track, purely in the pits. In Trans Am, where winning margins were heavily measured in single fleeting seconds, this was precisely like bringing a gun to a knife fight. The very first time Penske's crew actively demonstrated the system in fierce competition, rival team managers frankly couldn't believe what they were actually seeing. Bud Moore, who impressively ran the factory Ford Mustang team, was reportedly left entirely speechless when he helplessly watched a Penske Camaro effortlessly complete a full fuel stop in drastically less time than it routinely took his dedicated crew to roughly get the very first dump completely empty. Moore was decidedly no amateur. He was officially one of the most highly successful crew chiefs in all of NASCAR history. If anybody knew anything about ruthless pit stop efficiency, it was definitely Bud Moore, and even he was visibly stunned. The deep psychological impact on those rival teams was almost as strategically significant as the actual physical time advantage. Imagine you're confidently leading a grueling race. You've been fiercely pushing hard, flawlessly managing your tires, and cleanly hitting your specific marks absolutely perfectly. You cleanly come in for your highly anticipated scheduled pit stop, feeling exceptionally good about your strong position. Your well-trained crew impressively executes a flawlessly smooth stop. 15 short seconds later, you're rapidly accelerating right back on track. Then you vividly watch in absolute horror as the Penske Camaro casually exits ahead. Not because you made a mistake, just pure technological superiority. But in racing, when you start dominating the track with an unfair advantage, the protests aren't far behind. Ford, and specifically Bud Moore, was about to throw the entire rulebook right at Penske. The 1969 season saw Mark Donohue and Roger Penske dominate Trans Am in a way that simply hadn't been seen before. But success in racing breeds intense scrutiny, and Penske's massive 20-foot fuel tower attracted plenty of that. Rival teams, particularly the Ford factory operation, began immediately filing aggressive protests. They fiercely argued that the pressurized system constituted a fundamentally illegal modification. The rule, they loudly claimed, specifically stated that refueling had to be done with approved standard containers. Was a 20-foot tall, heavily pressurized scuba tank-powered tower really a container in the true spirit of the rules? The protests got incredibly nasty. Moore's team accused Penske not just of dangerously bending the rules with the fuel system, but of outright malicious cheating in other areas. They claimed the Camaros were secretly running illegal camshafts, drastically oversized engines, and highly modified suspension components that were completely off limits. Now, you might be thinking, were they actually cheating, or was Ford just being a sore loser? Well, some of these wild accusations were undeniably born from pure frustration. When you're getting beaten that badly week after week, you start desperately looking for reasons beyond the obvious. The Sports Car Club of America, Trans Am's governing sanctioning body, found themselves in a very difficult position. Technically, Penske's elaborate fuel system didn't actually violate any specific written rules. The regulations dictated the general type and maximum capacity of the fuel containers allowed inside the active pits, but they noticeably didn't explicitly prohibit pressurization or thermal cooling. Penske had brilliantly found a massive loophole, and he was enthusiastically driving a Chevrolet Camaro straight through it at full racing speed. The SCCA officials conducted incredibly thorough inspections. They completely tore down the engines piece by piece, measured internal components with micrometers, and checked the physical weights of the cars repeatedly. They ultimately found the Penske Camaros to be completely legal in absolutely every measurable way. The fuel tower, they officially ruled, was merely a pit equipment innovation, not a direct car modification. It was certainly a highly creative interpretation of the rulebook, but it was definitively not a violation. This official ruling obviously didn't satisfy Ford. Bud Moore was absolutely convinced that Penske had to be cheating somehow. The raw performance advantage was just way too great to be logically explained by simple pit stops alone. Moore's mechanics stubbornly started their own pit innovations, developing slightly faster wheel change procedures and frantically experimenting with their own rudimentary fuel delivery systems, but they were hopelessly playing catch-up. And Roger Penske certainly wasn't standing still. By the mid-season of 1969, several other teams were desperately attempting to copy Penske's pressurized system, but here's what most people don't realize about mimicking advanced engineering. Building a functional pressurized fuel tower wasn't nearly as simple as it looked from the outside. The internal pressure had to be precisely and flawlessly regulated. Too much unregulated pressure, and you'd violently blow highly flammable racing fuel absolutely everywhere when connecting the hose. Too little pressure, and you obviously wouldn't get the desired flow rate advantage you were looking for. The complex cooling system had to be carefully calibrated. The intricate quick connect fittings had to be heavily machined to exact microscopic tolerances. Look, it was genuinely dangerous. Jerry Titus, aggressively driving for Terry Gottsahl's dedicated Pontiac team, nearly had a fatal disaster when their homemade, heavily pressurized system catastrophically failed during a tense pit stop at Donnybrook. The crucial connector didn't seal properly, forcefully spraying raw pressurized fuel violently over the extremely hot car and the panicked crew. Only the incredibly quick action with safety fire extinguishers miraculously prevented a horrific catastrophe. After that terrifying incident, most rival teams quietly decided that maybe the old-fashioned gravity dump cans weren't really so bad after all. To really appreciate this, let's look at the raw data. The actual technical specifications of Penske's highly refined system were utterly remarkable for 1969. The tower could consistently deliver 11 full gallons of 104-octane racing fuel in exactly 8.2 seconds on average. That is a blistering flow rate of roughly 80 gallons per minute. For direct comparison, a totally modern NASCAR fuel can, which utilizes very similar pressurization principles today, delivers fuel at about 90 gallons per minute. Roger Penske was essentially achieving nearly modern 21st century flow rates using basic 1969 technology. It is staggering. The cooling system could effortlessly chill the racing fuel to approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit even on a sweltering 90-degree summer day. This dramatically increased the fluid's density by about 2%, effectively giving the powerful Camaros an extra half horsepower per gallon of fuel. Over the course of a full fuel tank, that meant roughly 5 completely additional horsepower derived just from manipulating the fuel temperature. It really doesn't sound like a lot, but in a highly competitive series where naturally aspirated engines were strictly limited to about 450 total horsepower, absolutely every single microscopic bit of power counted immensely. The precise pressure regulation system was perhaps the most technically sophisticated hidden component. Penske's brilliant crew chief, Chuck Cantwell, had painstakingly developed a complex two-stage mechanical regulator that flawlessly maintained exactly 18.5 psi, regardless of exactly how much raw fuel was currently sitting inside the massive tower. This absolute consistency was totally crucial. Variable, unpredictable pressure would inevitably mean highly variable flow rates, which would then make it virtually impossible to accurately predict pit stop times for the overall race strategy. The brilliant human element was just as wonderfully important as the shiny new physical technology. Penske repeatedly drilled his entire pit crew relentlessly every single day until perfection was achieved. But brilliant technology is utterly useless without flawless execution. And Penske was about to completely reinvent the way human beings moved around a race car. Now, you might be thinking that a faster fuel can just mean the guy holding it stands there for less time. But it goes so much deeper than that. Penske essentially applied the brutal, calculated logic of a factory assembly line directly to a chaotic, high-pressure pit box. They practiced these fuel stops hundreds, literally hundreds, of times before they ever actually tried it in a live race scenario. They relentlessly refined every single microscopic movement until it was pure muscle memory. Here's what most people don't realize about traditional pit stops back then. The fueler didn't just casually stroll up and pour. He had to haul a heavy can, negotiate his body around the hot car, and carefully try not to dump raw gasoline onto glowing exhaust pipes. It was clumsy. But with Penske's new system, the fueler didn't just connect a hose. He had a highly specific, mandated stance. He utilized a specific rehearsed grip on the nozzle. He used a specific calculated body motion that absolutely minimized connection time. The fuel tower operator, the guy physically managing the valves on the rig itself, had to start the air pressurization sequence at exactly the precise right fraction of a second. If he triggered it too early, the pressure would build far too high before the nozzle was seated, risking a massive blowout. If he triggered it too late, the fluid flow rate would immediately suffer, and they would bleed precious seconds. It was a perfectly choreographed mechanical ballet. This is where it gets really interesting. Penske even fundamentally analyzed the basic human ergonomics of the pit stop. He quickly realized that the traditional, accepted method of having the fueler awkwardly stand directly beside the car meant taking extra steps and wasting physical motion. With the new pressurized system's advanced quick connect fitting, the fueler could securely stand primarily behind the rear quarter panel of the car, drastically reducing his overall body movement to almost absolutely nothing. Step, connect, squeeze, disconnect, done. 8 seconds flat. It was absolutely devastating to watch. The overall impact on the rest of the Trans Am racing grid was incredibly profound and immediate. Other racing teams suddenly had to completely rethink their entire race day strategies just to survive. Some desperate teams actively tried to logically avoid these costly pit stops altogether, aggressively stretching their long fuel runs to the absolute ragged limit of the car's capacity. Predictably, this risky strategy directly led to several spectacularly embarrassing failures, as high-profile cars literally ran entirely dry out on the middle of the active track, coasting to a sad halt. Jim Hall's legendary Chaparral team, known for their own wild innovations, boldly experimented with installing much larger fuel cells, desperately trying to reduce the total number of required stops. But here's the fatal flaw with that logic. Gasoline is incredibly heavy. A gallon of racing fuel weighs roughly 6 pounds. Carrying an extra 10 gallons meant dragging around 60 extra pounds of dead weight through every single corner. That severe weight penalty completely negated any slight time advantage they might have gained from stopping less frequently. Penske's innovation had completely trapped them. They couldn't outpit him, and they couldn't simply outdrive the heavy physics of a massive, sloshing fuel tank. Of course, this level of unchecked dominance forced the Sports Car Club of America to inevitably reconsider their incredibly vague regulations. For the historic 1970 season, entirely new, highly restrictive rules were swiftly introduced that specifically and aggressively addressed pit refueling equipment. The use of extreme external pressurization was heavily limited. The maximum overall tower height was strictly restricted to a much more reasonable elevation. The playing field was forcefully leveled by the governing body, but look, the damage was already permanently done. Roger Penske had flawlessly demonstrated that in professional auto racing, pure innovation wasn't just strictly about what physically happened on the actual track surface. The historic 1969 racing season ultimately ended with Mark Donohue officially winning the highly coveted Trans Am Championship for Penske. They secured 10 dominant wins in just 12 total races. It was a display of total, absolute domination. While Donohue's masterful, surgical driving was certainly a massive factor, absolutely everyone walking in the paddock knew the actual truth. Those blistering 8-second pit stops were the undeniable difference between a merely good racing season and an immortal, legendary one. In several tightly contested races, Donohue had been running solidly in second or third place right before the scheduled pit stops, only to magically emerge comfortably in the overall lead purely thanks to the massive 8-second mechanical advantage. The raw financial impact of this simple innovation was actually incredibly significant too. Now, you might assume that prize money in Trans Am was huge, but it really wasn't. However, winning consistently brought massive, lucrative corporate sponsorship. Sunoco, Penske's primary financial sponsor, saw absolutely huge, unquantifiable value in the repeated national television coverage, showing their bright blue car rapidly pulling away from frustrated rivals immediately after every single pit stop. The towering fuel rig, which critically cost an estimated $50,000 to secretly develop back in 1969, easily paid for itself many times over in pure, unadulterated marketing value alone. To properly put that into modern perspective, his frustrated competitors were easily spending $50,000 just on a single, highly stressed engine rebuild that might maybe net them 5 extra horsepower. Penske spent that exact same amount of money on a bunch of aluminum tubes, scuba gear, and ice, and effectively bought himself almost an entire minute of pure advantage per race. It perfectly highlights a brilliant concept. The very best financial investment in racing isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes, stepping completely outside the vehicle provides the biggest possible return. It genuinely revolutionized auto racing forever. But the true legacy of this 20-foot tower didn't stop at the finish line. It fundamentally changed the way businesses, engineers, and even modern Formula One teams operate today. The engineering principles behind Roger Penske's fuel tower heavily influenced motorsport for decades to come. Today, almost every major racing series globally uses some form of pressurized refueling or advanced fluid dynamics for pit stops. NASCAR's current, highly advanced generation of pit equipment can easily trace its direct mechanical lineage straight back to Penske's simple 1969 innovation. Formula One, before high-speed refueling was ultimately banned for extreme safety reasons, utilized complex systems that rapidly delivered highly combustible fuel at over 12 liters per single second. All of that was entirely based on the exact same basic pressure differential principle that Roger Penske pioneered in the pits at Riverside. Modern professional racing teams proudly spend absolutely millions of dollars on computational fluid dynamics, relentlessly analyzing every single microscopic aspect of fuel flow using supercomputers. But back in 1969, Penske stunningly achieved nearly optimal, maximum theoretical flow rates with literally nothing more than basic high school physics and some good old-fashioned mechanical experimentation. Chuck Cantwell later revealed that they meticulously went through over 30 distinctly different physical nozzle designs before finally finding the exact one that predictably delivered maximum fluid flow without causing dangerous restrictive turbulence. It was trial and error at its absolute finest. The ingenious cooling system concept also had an incredibly lasting, profound impact. Modern racing teams competing in grueling endurance racing today still actively chill their fuel, though modern safety regulations usually strictly limit exactly how dangerously cold it can physically be. The underlying physical principle perfectly remains the exact same. Cooler liquid fuel is physically denser fuel, and denser liquid fuel simply means you get significantly more explosive energy packed tightly per gallon. Penske certainly didn't invent this basic thermodynamic concept, but he was absolutely the very first pioneer to successfully and safely implement it in top-tier American road racing. Now, you might be thinking, surely someone else would have figured this out eventually, right? Well, maybe. But the lightning-fast quick connect fitting that Penske specifically developed quickly became the absolute, undisputed industry standard. The basic mechanical design, with a few very minor modern safety modifications, is remarkably still used today in absolutely everything from heavy NASCAR stock cars to sophisticated international sports car endurance racing. The distinct, incredibly satisfying mechanical click of a properly connected high-pressure fuel hose is a deeply familiar sound that literally every single professional pit crew member universally knows today. And that exact distinct sound effectively started directly with Penske's brilliant 1969 physical innovation. Looking back historically, what made Penske's towering fuel rig so genuinely remarkable wasn't its supposed mechanical complexity. It was actually its sheer beautiful simplicity. In an era when desperate racing teams were recklessly spending massive absolute fortunes on exotic, unreliable engine modifications and completely experimental aerodynamic tweaks, Penske simply won by actively thinking about something as incredibly basic as how to pour liquid faster. He didn't maliciously break the written rules. He didn't even really bend them in a malicious way. He just looked at them from a completely different analytical angle. The tower represented a massive, seismic shift in basic racing philosophy. Before 1969, true innovation in professional racing generally meant just making your physical car go faster. After 1969, it fundamentally meant making your entire holistic racing operation faster. The physical car, the human driver, the dedicated pit crew, the mechanical pit equipment, and even the chemical makeup of the liquid fuel itself. Absolutely everything was a highly potential source of a massive competitive advantage. This brilliant, holistic approach to professional racing would permanently become Roger Penske's lasting signature. In the fast-paced world of IndyCar, his meticulous teams would ultimately become universally famous for their unparalleled preparation and their relentless attention to tiny details. In NASCAR, Penske Racing would decisively set bold new standards for incredible professionalism and brutal efficiency. The tiny seeds of all that massive future success were firmly planted way back in 1969 with a 20-foot aluminum tower and those blistering 8-second pit stops. The human stories behind this mechanical innovation are equally fascinating. Chuck Cantwell, who personally designed much of the system, was a brilliant mechanical engineer who had officially started his career at Chevrolet's Advanced Research and Development Division. He brought a new level of technical sophistication to American racing that was unusual for the time period. While other crew chiefs were generally former mechanics who had slowly worked their way up the ladder, Cantwell boldly approached complex problems exactly like the brilliant engineer he truly was. Mark Donohue, who directly benefited the most from the drastically faster pit stops, actually had mixed, complicated feelings about the massive competitive advantage. As a pure racer, he wanted to win on pure, raw driving skill alone. But as a highly educated engineer himself, he deeply appreciated the pure, undeniable elegance of the mechanical solution. In the end, the story of Penske's fuel tower is about more than professional racing. It is about looking at difficult problems differently. It is about finding advantages where others aren't bothering to look. It is about the power of elegant solutions to complex mechanical problems. And it is about how one racing team's refusal to accept the status quo forever changed an entire sport. What is the most innovative racing solution you have ever seen? Something so simple yet effective that it changed absolutely everything. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on the engineering innovations that revolutionized racing. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We are just getting started.